Hey, everybody out there. Hope everybody's doing well on this fine Wednesday. Welcome to another week of Tasting Together. My name's Pat Fahey. I'm a Master Cicerone. I'm the content director for the Cicerone certification program. And welcome to our first ever beer and food pairing session on Tasting Together. So, with Tasting Together every week, we get together and talk about some topic from the general canon of beer knowledge topics. Up until this point, we've really only focused on beer styles. Like I mentioned, today we're doing something a little bit different. We're going to focus on a pairing, specifically American IPA and blue cheese. But I'm also going to take this opportunity to talk more broadly about beer and food pairing in general. If you've joined us in the past, thanks for coming back. Last week we got down talking about Wee Heavy. Check that out if you missed it. If this is your first time, as I always say up front, please, as we're going through, throw up any questions that you have. One of the things that makes these sessions a lot more valuable, at least to the people that watch them live, is the ability to ask questions. And while I won't necessarily address your questions as they come in, I've got somebody who's aggregating them for me. So I'll try to make sure that I get to everybody before we sign off. So a couple of other notes before we get started. Next week, we're going to be doing Weissbier, like a German Hefeweizen. And we don't have anything on the calendar beyond that. I'm talking with the team here, and we're figuring out what sessions we want to do for the rest of the month of July. So we'll probably be making an announcement, either posting to the blog about what sessions we'll be doing, maybe end of this week, early next week, or I'll just end up announcing when we get together next Wednesday. So tune in then if you want to know what we're doing for the rest of the month. So like I said, doing something a little bit different this week, and I certainly had fun preparing for it and sitting around and eating cheese and drinking several different beers with it. So hopefully you guys enjoy this. You'll have to let me know when we're done if you want to see more of these kind of mixed in with styles and other topics, or if you want to mostly just stick to doing beer styles. But hopefully you were able to secure an American IPA and a blue cheese. I am drinking Half Acres Vallejo, and I have a couple cheeses here. I guess I can show these too. So I have a blue cheese from Jasper Hills, and then a blue cheese from Point Reyes, their Bay Blue. Primarily going to focus on the Bay Blue, but when I was shopping for them, I was like, oh, they have a Jasper Hills one. Jasper Hills is a creamery in Vermont that I love. They had it for like $6. So I was like, I should at least try that. I'm more familiar with the Bay Blue, and it's a cheese that I love generally, but also for pairing. And so that's the one that I'll focus on when we talk about the pairing. But if you have not said so already, and I've seen a few people throwing out in the comments, let me know what it is that you're drinking and tasting. And as much as I want to just start digging in on the cheese now so that I can talk, I'll probably talk first and wait a little bit to talk about that. So since this is the first time we've really focused explicitly on beer and food pairing, I want to spend some time talking about pairing more generally. I'm going to cover some of the basics of pairing here, but I'll try to do it relatively quickly. I want to make sure that for those of you that aren't necessarily super familiar with beer and food pairing principles, that you're able to sort of follow along, but also hopefully for people that are very familiar with pairing, you'll pick up something new here. And I definitely have a few things, I'm presenting this in a way that I haven't necessarily presented beer and food pairing before. I've done a lot of presentation on beer and food pairing for Cicerone over the years, but I've kind of been workshopping a new way to talk about it and think about it a little bit. So bear with me as I go through this, but hopefully you guys find it useful. And one of the things that I always like to acknowledge when talking about pairing is that among all of the things that we teach and talk about at Cicerone and like all of the topics that exist in the canon of beer things, pairing is definitely one of the most subjective, in that, it what people like is going to vary based to some extent on personal preference. Not every pairing, even if it's like a really well constructed pairing, is going to appeal to everyone. So there's an element of subjectivity to it. I also like to start by mentioning that like there are a lot of different valid ways to go about assembling pairings, and everyone that I know and have talked to does it a little bit differently. So the way I'm going to kind of talk about this reflects how I tend to approach pairing. But like I said, hopefully you can glean something from that that's useful for how you approach pairing. And I'm gonna start with like a somewhat controversial statement. I know I just said that like everybody kind of has their own way and there's no one right way to do it. But one thing that I have found having conversations with lots of exam candidates about how about pairing is that a lot of people, uh, I don't want to say they approach it wrong because there isn't technically a wrong way to do it, but I think that a lot of people approach pairing in a way or think about constructing pairings in a way where they put more emphasis on things that are less important and they ignore some of the more important pieces and end up constructing pairings then that like maybe sound good on paper but end up not working. I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that. I have had the very unique experience of having. I've served as an oral examiner for the Advanced and Master Cicerone, specifically talking about beer and food for a number of them, and so I've had these conversations with literally hundreds of people, and have gotten some insights into some of the ways people approach pairings that maybe ignores some of the more important pieces of putting a pairing together. Now, I think part of this is a product of the way that we talk about beer and the sort of the emphasis that we have on beer flavor. When we talk about the characteristics of a beer, we're very, very much focused on flavor characteristics, largely driven by aromas, and that's great. I think that that is a perfectly viable way, and like it's the way that I talk about and teach about beer. So much of the flavor experience is driven by aroma. However, what I think that leads people to do is that when they think about how they want to construct a pairing, they start from the flavors. They start from really the aromatic components and try to think, okay, what aromatics does this beer have? What flavors would that line up well with in the dish that I'm trying to match it with? And the thing is that that's not really, at least my opinion, that's not where you want to start. You want to begin, whenever you're building a pairing, begin by addressing a couple other components, namely intensity and structural components of the pairing. And by structural components, I mean mouthfeel elements and taste elements. And like this is not like groundbreaking or new to suggest that like you should pay attention to intensity, and even to say like intensity is the first thing you should consider. I think a lot of people who have studied pairing would agree with that. However, in talking to people and asking them to put pairings together for me, that's not usually the first thing that they consider. They usually first will talk about flavor elements, sometimes totally ignoring these other components. And I think that a lot of times when you do have a pairing where it looks good on paper, but it ends up falling flat in practice, it's a result of matching up aromatic elements or flavor elements, not paying attention to structural elements. So really quickly, let's talk a little bit about some of the structural elements. And like I said, I'm going to go through these kind of fast. That way, if you're already super familiar with these concepts, you're not bored. And if you're not, you can ask questions and I can go into more depth at the end. But first, talk a little bit about intensity. And intensity really is, I think, the most important thing to consider when matching beer and food. Um, Intensity, there are a lot of different ways to describe intensity, but most generally, it's easiest to think of intensity as just like the sum total of all of the components of either a beer or a dish that contribute to its overall intensity. And I there are a few different ways to break it down. I've kind of broken it down here through like the lens of, once again, talking about structural components, so mouthfeel and taste, and then flavor elements, things that are more driven by aroma characteristics. So in beer, you might be looking at structural elements of body and carbonation, and even astringency can play a very important role in pairing. And then on the taste side of structural elements, you're looking at things like bitterness and acidity and sweetness, if there's any notable sweetness present in the beer. And then on the flavor side, you're looking at the whole world of beer flavors. So malt aromatics, hop aromatics, yeast, any other flavors, if there's smoke or barrel character or things driven by what, anything else. Anything else lives in that flavor realm. And basically, the higher any of those elements get, or as those elements combine, as you have more of multiple of those different structural and flavor elements, the overall intensity of the beer gets stronger. On the food side, there are a few different ways to present it. And one of the ways that we often will talk about food intensity is to think about it through the lens of the intensity of the individual ingredients. So for example, you're thinking protein, like steak is a more intense, like a ribeye is a more intense protein than a chicken breast is. Then you can talk about preparation. So basically how much heat you're applying to it is going to lead to higher levels of intensity. Grilling something is going to be a lot more of an intense preparation method than baking would be. Or, you know, having like a pan-fried ahi tuna is going to be a lot more intensive of preparation than if you served it raw, like nigiri over some rice. So preparation plays in. And then we also talk about like sauces and other kind of accompaniments, other elements of a dish contributing to intensity. That's certainly one way to think about it. I think another equally valid way is to think in a similar sort of framework, like a structural and flavor element framework, to kind of think about the overall intensity of the dish. It's still going to pull in all the same elements. So when you're thinking structural, we're looking at mouthfeels. To my estimation, like the big mouthfeels that are really important in food, one is going to be temperature. That's not so much of a thing in beer. Beer is usually like cold or cool. It's not usually something outside of those. Usually once the beer is warm, you're like, I'm not drinking that. But with food, you can have a range of temperatures from frozen to cold to cool to room temperature, warm, hot. All of those are different mouthfeel things, and those will impact the way that something pairs. Other things to watch out for that are really important on the mouthfeel front are things like creamy textures or anything that's sort of palate coating. And then the other really big mouthfeel thing that's important to watch out for is spiciness, capsaicin heat, which is another thing that it is not a taste. It is driven by actual activation of heat receptors on your tongue. So capsaicin heat, another thing that's important to consider on the food side in the structural elements. And then of course you have tastes. And in food, all of the tastes are fair game. You know, sweet, sour, salty, bitter, umami, fat. Anything is fair game there. And then when you look at flavor aromatics, you once again have a huge world of possibilities there. But within food, once again, intensity is going to be driven by, as you have more of any of those elements, the intensity gets higher and higher. And there's no like exacting scale for intensity. When I think about intensity of beer and food, I usually will try to pin it on like a 5-point scale. But even then, like it's not 100% important that you're able to like really narrow down like, okay, the intensity of this dish is a 3.2. Like that doesn't matter at all. And in truth, while we say that like matching intensity is really important, and I agree in a lot of cases intensity should be matched, there are definitely examples where you can still put together a good pairing where the intensity of one is significantly higher than the other. I've talked about a number of styles over the previous weeks that I would put in like the quaffable category. Shout out to all the quaff life people out there. But when you have a beer that is really refreshing and that you can drink in quantity, you can potentially match that up against something that is higher in intensity on the food side, where you're not necessarily looking specifically to have this really nice balanced interplay of food and beer, but you're looking for the beer to serve as a refresher alongside the food. So in that case, like the intensity doesn't have to be matched exactly. And so I would say that if I talk about how you want to think about intensity, a lot of cases you want it to be matched. In some cases, it's going to be okay if they're not matched or if they're slightly mismatched. Usually if they're like grossly mismatched, it's not going to work. One is going to flatten the other. But you can definitely have cases where they don't have to be exactly matched. The important thing, though, is that you address intensity. You think about intensity. And I kind of mentioned this, and like, I'm just going to say it again. Always consider intensity and consider it like first thing when you're putting together a pairing. I can think of like multiple occasions where I've been sitting with an oral exam candidate and I've, had a beer that we're both tasting and said, construct an entree that you would pair with this. And they go, okay, this beer has flavors of X, Y, and Z, and I want to match with those sorts of flavors in this way. And they take me down and they construct this excellent sounding dish where like the flavors work up, but the intensities are totally off. And it's just so clear that at no point did they consider intensity. So always think about intensity. And at least if you're in a scenario where you're, God forbid, doing an oral exam where you have to talk about beer and food pairing, address intensity, mention at least that, and show that you've at least thought about and considered that, because it is so important and so fundamental. So I think that's all I want to say about intensity. I'm going to have a sip of beer. The next thing to talk about, structural elements. And structural elements is sort of the name that I've just taken to using for this, but this is mouthfeel and taste. And when I look at pairings that sound like they would work and haven't, in a lot of cases where they end up falling flat is that mouthfeel and taste elements have not been appropriately considered. And first and foremost, what I'm looking for when I look at these things are things that would disrupt a pairing. One thing you may have found if you eat food and drink beer together often is that beer works with food pretty well. Like in a lot of cases, as long as there's not something present that's going to like wreck the pairing or derail it, beer makes a really good partner to food, and a lot of different styles can work with a lot of different dishes. So when I'm looking at things that will derail a pairing in the mouthfeel area, once again, on the food side, I'm looking at things that are palate coating. I'm looking at things that have capsaicin heat. And I'm going to leave capsaicin alone for now, just because like I could do an entire session, and maybe I will, about how to address spiciness in pairing, because it is something that is challenging to deal with. But fatty or creamy textures, things that are really heavy on the palate, that's a place where beer is really, really well suited. And there are a lot of things that we can use in the realm of different beer attributes to address those characteristics. Carbonation is probably number one, but acidity is another thing that can do a really good job of cleaning up or reducing acid or reducing mouth coating, fat, or other textures on the palate. Bitterness can to some extent, and astringency sort of in line with that. Both of those things can sort of counteract fatty, creamy textures to some extent. So when I encounter something that, like in a dish that has those textures, I am looking for a beer that can do something to help mitigate those characteristics. Similarly, when I have a beer that's high in carbonation or bitterness or acidity, in a lot of cases, I'm looking for something that has those textural elements to sort of balance and dampen um, those characteristics in the beer. In a lot of cases where you do have balancing done by the beer onto the food, that element of the food is also balancing that element of the beer. And it's an interplay. It's important to always consider not just what does the beer do to the food, but what does the food do to the beer. In some cases, that's an even more important consideration, and one that I think a lot of people in some cases leave out, unfortunately. Um, Also, in this realm of structural things, uh, tastes are so important to consider, and tastes are another place where pairings can really fall apart, especially if you have foods that have really high levels of one specific taste. I think I told an anecdote about this um, on here, a ceviche pairing that I tried to put together where, once again, and this was a long time ago, and so I wasn't as, this pairing actually taught me this lesson, but I looked at the flavor elements of the ceviche and it had like lime and grapefruit citrus. And I was like, wit beer, like with the coriander and the citrus elements, like those flavors, those aromatic elements are going to line up so well with this dish. And the ceviche was so acidic, and it made the wit beer just taste like flat and bland and terrible. And it was, at the time, I was like, oh, this is one that like sounded good on paper, but you don't actually know until you try them. Reflecting on it, that's a pairing that I put together based on aromatic or flavor elements, and I didn't consider the underlying structural elements, and that's why it fell apart. So that's just kind of like another little example that I hope helps illustrate how important it is to start from intensity and structural elements and then use flavor to fine tune. I mean, in all honesty, if you have the intensity considered and matched to the extent that you want it to be, and you've considered the underlying like taste and mouthfeel structural elements, your pairing is probably going to be good. At that point, it's probably good, maybe even great. To get it into that like exceptional or transcendental area, that's where you refine aroma and flavor elements. And that's really important too. But like I said, what I've found from talking to people about pairing is that even though a lot of people will say intensity matching, that's the most important thing in pairing, when they actually go to put together a pairing, that's not where they start. So this is just kind of me imploring you, when you put together a pairing, every time you put together a pairing, consider those elements. That will help make sure that you don't put together something that seems like it will work and you're like, oh, I thought this through and it has these really great flavor interactions, but then you try it and it just falls apart because the foundation isn't there. So that leaves us with the pairing that we have today, blue cheese and IPA. And I want to talk first about beer and cheese generally. One of the things I don't know if this is actually changing or if I just feel like it's changing because I definitely have more beer people in my general orbit. But for a long time, there's been sort of this romantic notion behind the idea of wine and cheese pairing. And I'd like to think that people have started to figure out that beer just is generally a much better companion to cheese than wine is, for several reasons. First of all, carbonation is so huge. So much of cheese is like fatty and palate coating. Having something that is going to effectively clean that off your palate, which beer will typically do because of its carbonation, is hugely important. It gives beer a boost like right off the bat. The other thing, though, is there's a lot of overlap in terms of the flavors that you might see. Cheese is made from milk, and milk's flavor is to some extent determined by the different types of grasses and other plants that whatever animal's milk is being used, whether it's goats or sheep's or cow's milk, um, that's going to be influenced by the plants that the animal eats prior to being milked. In beer, once again, one of the base flavors of beer is coming from barley, which is the grain of a grass. There is a synergy and there's some overlap in similar sorts of flavors that we get in in cheese and beer because of those sort of similarities in where they come from. So I could go deeper than that, but we'll just leave it at those two things for now. So let's talk about the elements of the pairing first. First of all, American IPA. Cheese plus beer does equal cheer. I'll agree with that wholeheartedly. So American IPA, style that a lot of people are familiar with. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail, but you're looking at moderate to assertive bitterness, elevated alcohol content. Depending upon where it's being made and the interpretation, could have no sweetness, could have low level sweetness or moderate level of sweetness. If you're getting up around moderate level of sweetness, you're probably trending more towards like a New England IPA style. But West Coast IPA is going to see less malt character and virtually no sweetness. I think of like classic American IPA, like IPA brands that have been around since the 90s, like Bell's Two Hearted or Goose Island IPA or Lagunitas IPA. A lot of those kind of like, I'll call them heritage IPA brands, are going to have a bit more malt character and a bit more sweetness to them. And so that will certainly play into how they pair with different sorts of things. And then the other really important element, and once again, fine-tuning element, is the aromatic profile. And that can vary pretty widely. You could have more of a classic American profile where it's focused on like citrus, grapefruit, tangerine sort of notes, and then maybe like piney, resiny notes. Or these days, American IPA can feature any of the wide variety of different hop flavors that we see. So like tropical fruit, like pineapple, guava, papaya, mango, caddy notes that lean into like black currant or passion fruity kind of places, things that work in like the garlic, chive, green onion family of flavors. Wide variety of different hop flavors that you can see in an American IPA. So I'll talk specifically about the ones that I'm getting in this beer when I taste them together in a second. So then talk about blue cheese a little bit. Blue cheese, very fatty, very salty, very palate coating. And then there's the blue part. How does it get blue? Blue cheese is typically going to be inoculated with a penicillium mold, which produces the blue veining and some of the flavors that we associate with that cheese. There are also some other types of bacteria that are used in the production of blue cheese that also contribute to those characteristic flavors. But those flavors can range from mild to intense and have there are a lot of different fatty acid breakdown compounds that occur during the various fermentation processes and production of these cheeses that lead to a variety of different esters and alcohols and ketones, with flavors ranging from like fruity and herbal notes to earthy, mushroomy notes to like outright body odor notes. Some of the bacteria that are active in blue cheese production are the same bacteria that produce certain elements of human body odor. So take that as you will. In low levels, it's a pleasant note of complexity, perhaps. But so we have this really funky aromatic canvas to work with, in addition to those structural elements of creamy texture, a lot of fat, a lot of salt. So why does this pairing work? Let's look at those two most important things that we've talked about kind of throughout this little chat. Intensity. First of all, American IPA on the overall scale of intensity, I'm gonna put it at like 4 out of 5 typically. And that's, it can totally vary on the beer, but once again, rough estimate, it's like it's medium plus intensity. Blue cheese, similarly, it's a pretty intense food item. It's not the most intense thing you'll encounter, but it's got a pretty high concentration of flavor. So we've got matched intensity. That's good. Let's look at the structural elements. So we've got a very palate coating thing in our food. We want something that's going to help clean that up. We've got carbonation in the beer. We've got bitterness in the beer. Those two things are going to help address those elements. Similarly, very high level of salt present in the cheese. Bitterness tends to work well with salty things. Acidity can also work well with salty foods. And in some cases, sweetness in beer can also play nicely off of salty foods. The beer that I have here is, it's in the style of a West Coast IPA, so it's pretty dry. I would like to try this again alongside something like a Bell's Two Hearted. I feel like that little bit of sweetness that you get in that beer has a little bit more residual sweetness because it's made with crystal malt, I believe. That would probably help line up and sort of help to soften the salt of the cheese even a little bit further. And actually, I remember presenting blue cheese and IPA pairing alongside Randy Mosier at a Craft Brewers Conference, God, like 5 years ago now in Portland in 2015. And we sat down and tasted a few different IPAs and a few different cheeses, and we settled on the Point Reyes Bay Blue. And we used Firestone Walker's Union Jack, which I would say falls into that more classic IPA style. Firestone Walker obviously is a California brewery, but that beer's been around for a long time. And Matt Burleson cut his teeth at Goose Island before he ended up out there. I believe Matt was responsible for Goose Island's IPA and then also for Union Jack. So that beer definitely has a little bit more malt character, a little bit more sweetness, and just works so well with that cheese. So I'm gonna have some cheese now. You guys have been getting to enjoy cheese this whole time. Couple notes on eating cheese. A lot of you are probably more familiar with assessing cheese than you are with assessing beer. I'm not going to go through the whole process since I've already spent a lot of time with this cheese over the last couple days. But a couple important notes. First of all, cheese is usually going to be stored cold. You want to let it warm up to room temperature. It's going to express its flavor in the way it's meant to at room temperature. It's just a lot more muted if you try tasting it straight out of the fridge. So I'd say give it at least half an hour out of the fridge before, like if you want to eat it or you want to serve it, like pull it out at least half an hour, even an hour ahead of time will help to make sure it comes to room temperature. Definitely smell it before you taste it. And then when you taste it, pay attention to the taste elements, but really pay attention to the mouthfeel of it. Like one of the things that differentiates a lot of cheeses or distinguishes different cheeses from one another is going to be things like fat content and pH and the interplay between those two, the effect that they have on texture. So pay attention to those things when you are consuming your cheese if you want to get to know your cheese a little bit better. God, this cheese is so good. So one of the things that I really, really like about the Bay Blue, it has kind of like, the blue character to it is milder than in some other examples. It's got sort of a mild herbal, earthy, mushroomy kind of character to it. But one of the things that really comes through in this cheese is that it also has, and I don't know exactly what this is from. I would imagine it has something to do with the production of the cheese, or the way that they select milk. But it has kind of like a caramel toffee, salted caramel undertone to it, which helps it match up really well with a wide variety of beers. But once again, when you pit this up against the IPA, and this, the Vallejo has, I would say its aromatic profile is kind of more like tropical fruit with some, like maybe a little guava, a little mango, a little pineapple, with also some green onion note to it. It makes for this almost like tropical fruit salsa interplay with the green onion character kind of bridging over to the like the herbal funky notes that you get in the cheese. And then once again, the most important part like is that all of those structural elements are in place. Put the structural elements in place, and then you can talk about all of the fun ways that the different flavor elements interact, and you can tweak and refine there. But if not for those structural elements being in place first, it might not matter that you have cool aromatic interplay. You wouldn't get a good pairing out of it. So I'm gonna eat a little more cheese and drink a little bit more beer, and then I will address your guys' questions. Seriously, if you havenent had Point Reyes Bay Blue and you can find it, and I got both of these just at Whole Foods, so fairly accessible, I would imagine, at least in the US. This is such a good cheese. It's so delicious. So let's take a look at this. Michael asked first about how about Trappist ale like Chimay beer and Chimay cheese. Yeah, we talk about that a little bit in the Belgian Road to Cicerone book. Trappist monasteries that produce Trappist beer, they're doing so to they produce beer to support the operations of the monastery, and a number of monasteries also produce other products to once again support the operations of the monastery. So several of them, Chimay is well known, but I believe Orval also produces cheese. I believe Westmalle also produces cheese. In a lot of cases, and once again, this gets back to kind of like what I said earlier, that as long as you don't have clashing elements in place, a lot of like, if you make sure structural elements are there and there's nothing that's going to clash, which is usually taken care of by that, you're going to have at least a decent pairing, maybe even a great pairing. We were trying these cheeses with several other beers, both last night and today. And like in a lot of cases, they worked pretty well. One that we had that we didn't love so much, I pulled some Rodenbach that I still had from the Flanders Red tasting to try alongside these. And, I have this romantic idea of them working really well because I like to think about it as like a cherry compote served alongside of this, where once again, looking at the flavor elements, they work really well. As it turned out though, the acidity level of that beer is probably a little bit too high for the cheese. And it ends up just kind of obliterating the cheese. Like it wasn't bad, but they didn't play nicely with one another, certainly. So Rodenbach Classic maybe would work well here. But back to kind of what you asked about. Yeah, last time I was over in Belgium, I was fortunate enough, was judging for the Brussels Beer Challenge, and our lunch one day was just Westmalle beer and Westmalle cheese, which was not like a super substantial lunch after having to judge like 20 Belgian quads, but it was still really good. I'll just leave it at that. Let's see. Eric asked, can you provide an example of on-paper pairing that fails due to violating the principles of pairing you discussed? Well, there's the one I just kind of threw out there of the Rodenbach with blue cheese. I love a blue cheese with like a dried fruit compote. I think it's such a nice marriage. But one of the things that a compote has that a lot of sour beers, and Rodenbach in particular, doesn't have is a significant amount of sweetness. And so you put that much, that intense of a beer and that much acidity with this cheese, and it ends up not being great. And then the wit beer ceviche one is another one that I think maybe even better illustrates that, because like the Rodenbach with the cheese, like it kind of runs over the cheese, but you're like, it's fine. The wit beer with the ceviche, the wit beer tastes bad. Like it was like I was using Allagash White, and as anybody who watched the wit beer talk knows, like I love Allagash White, and the Allagash White tastes like crap. And I was like, oh my God, if this food makes this phenomenal beer taste this way, then this is not meant to be in any way. So Jake asks if I can think of a scenario where the intensities are way different, but still a good pairing. For me, in cases where the intensity is way different, but it still works, it's less about interplay and more about the beer acting as a refresher. I think it can work when the beer intensity is lower. I think it's very rare where you'll have like a food that's really low in intensity. I can't think of one off the top of my head. We have like a food, like a light food. You're like, oh, I had this, this simple green salad with an American barley wine, and it was like, I can't think of an example, because the beer just like crushes the food. And if that's going to be the case, then like just drink the beer, and the food is an afterthought. Whereas I think that sometimes beer can still serve like a noble purpose, where you're not super focused on the beer, but it is just acting as an accompaniment. So I think of something like I don't know, maybe like a German Pils with some like really intense like pork knuckle in gravy, where like the dish is definitely more intense than the beer, but the beer is you still get a little bit of cutting power from the carbonation and from the bitterness of the beer. And so the beer is just serving to kind of like refresh, and some elements of it kind of link up. So those are cases, I think, where the intensity doesn't have to be matched perfectly, and you can still get a pairing that, once again, it's not like a delicate interplay of the flavors of the beer and the flavor of the food back and forth, because the food is kind of overwhelming the beer, but it's still a very enjoyable experience. And if it's an enjoyable experience, I'd call it a good pairing. So Chris asks, do you consider beer cocktails to be in the conceptual arena as pairings, or is that a whole different ball game? That's a really interesting question. There's some overlap. I mean, and I'm not I know a reasonable amount about spirits, as you may gather from just like and you can't even see the full extent of what's behind me. But I would not consider myself to be like an exceptionally talented mixologist or cocktail constructor. But one of the things that is really important when putting together a well-made cocktail is that it's balanced. And in a lot of cases, you are having to balance some of those same sorts of things, balancing sweetness against acidity, against other characteristics. And that, that could be extrapolated beyond that to even like cooking. Cooking, once again, is putting together a composed dish is an exercise in balance. You want acidity and salt and fat and all of these elements to be in balance with one another so that it works well. So I've done a little bit of beer cocktail work. I think I referenced on a talk previously, I did some work with a Scotch brand several years ago, where I worked with their kind of brand ambassador to put together some beer cocktails. I didn't necessarily approach it or think about it in the same way that I think about pairing beer with food, but once again, thinking about first and foremost, I think some of those structural elements, particular in the case of an all liquid format, you're looking at taste primarily. You want to make sure that the tastes are balanced appropriately so that the drink is enjoyable. And that's as good as I can do on that. Sorry if that's not as in depth as what you're looking for. Let's see. Patty asks, what does go with ceviche? Got a whole host of things. In that case, and that was a ceviche in particular that was challenging because it was, ceviche is some combination of different seafood or fish that is basically cooked in an acid, whether it's citrus juice or something else. That was a ceviche that was really, really acidic. And so that made it so that I pretty much had to reach for an acidic beer so that the dish didn't just like wreck whatever I paired with it. And I ended up pairing that with I think a blood orange Berliner Weiss that worked pretty well. So if it's a really acidic ceviche, you might want to go with something with a bit of acid to it. But also, and I saw somebody throw this out in the comments, like Mexican lager, like standard lager, can work really well in those scenarios. And once again, in that case, it is sort of letting the dish shine. As long as, once again, you could potentially have with a really acidic ceviche, it might make the beer taste unpleasant. But if you tried them side by side and it wasn't acidic enough to make the beer kind of flatten out, just having that kind of like light, refreshing beer paired up against what is a really light and bright, refreshing dish can work really nicely. I definitely can think of examples of having basically like Mexican lager and ceviche and having it be incredible. And then also when you're done, you can mix the leche de tigre, the juice in with the beer, and people will look at you weird, but it tastes delicious. So let's see. Brad asks, I like blue cheese. I'm okay with IPA. I've got 2 IPAs to try. I'm still not getting a tasty match. What am I missing? It could be that you need a better IPA, but what I would say is more likely is that this is coming down to your personal preference. I've definitely heard scenarios where somebody would be like, I'm not an IPA fan and I don't like blue cheese, but you put them together and I'm like, whoa, these are both great. That can happen, but it doesn't always happen. And still, what's going to drive people's pairing preference more than anything is their personal preferences. So when you're putting together what I would consider like a good pairing, it's something that a majority of people would find enhances the elements of the two things, or that the majority of people would agree that they're better together than they are on their own. If somebody doesn't like one of the elements of the pairing, even if it is like a great pairing, that doesn't mean that they're going to be like, wow, no, this is really good. So if you're not getting a match that you find to be really excellent, that could just be a product of the fact that like you don't love IPAs, and that's fine. That's a totally reasonable, and even I would say a somewhat like expected outcome. It would be way more like, wow, that's incredible to like put them together where you don't like one of the components to be like, oh, this is really good. If you put them together and you're like, it's not great, I'm like, well, that's kind of in line with you not necessarily liking IPA. So I wouldn't say you're doing anything wrong. Let's see. Sandra asks, would a vegan diet be a disadvantage to food pairing questions on any Cicerone exams? I can't relate to meat or seafood much at all. I would say that in general, it does make things more challenging. Like in our pairing exercises, like when we do pairing for the advanced Cicerone exam, we will take people's dietary restrictions into account for that, anybody who's sitting the test. And so we'll pick out a food item that works within that constraint. But in written portions of the test, you may still need to address what works well with certain flavors. And I view it from the same perspective of like, if you were working in a high-end restaurant and you have a vegan diet, but somebody is like, hey, what pairs well with my steak? Like, it wouldn't be acceptable to be like, well, I don't eat steak, so I don't have an answer for you. So what I would recommend in that circumstance is do what you can to try to find resources that give good flavor descriptions of like animal-based products. And like there are elements of like the crust you get on a good steak that you find in other things that are like heavily toasted or charred. Like there's overlap in those flavors. So you can, through a combination of kind of like reading and tasting things that are in the same sort of the same vein, trying to find close substitutes, you can hopefully at least build up sort of your theory around what should pair well with those things. And then also like, to take that one step further, like test that theory. If you have friends that don't kind of follow that same sort of diet, say, okay, I'm hearing you talk about this dish, or like I can at least smell the dish and I can think about the structural elements that I know are present. I think it would work well with this beer. Try it and get their feedback on it. Obviously, that's a lot more challenging than just being able to try the beer and the food together. But if your diet restricts you from doing those sorts of things, there are still creative approaches that you can potentially take to still be able to answer those questions in a reasonable way. Let's see. Natalia asks if I can address pairing between IPA and spicy food. There are sources that recommend it. Like I said, I will maybe do a full talk on spicy stuff somewhere down the road. I've seen like sources that are like IPA and spicy food, like never do it. And I've seen sources that are like IPA and spicy food, they're great together. What we do kind of know is that bitterness and astringency can kind of exacerbate chili heat or capsaicin heat to some extent. And so if you're looking to calm spiciness, bitter beer is not going to do that. And that's the one thing that I'd say. Whether or not it's a good pairing, that's going to depend on the level of heat and your level of heat tolerance. If you really like spicy things, then putting a bitter beer with a spicy dish might be awesome for you. But in general, if you're trying to calm or soothe capsaicin, I would stay away from super bitter things. Let's see, Michael asks, all cheeses are fatty, but do some beer styles pair better with dry cheeses and others with moist cheeses? With really moist cheeses, and I could be missing some, but when I think of really moist cheeses, I'm thinking of a lot of cheeses that are pretty light in intensity. Like Chev or standard goat cheese, ricotta, burrata, mozzarella. And so those are typically going to work well with more delicate beers, and you don't necessarily need a ton of cutting power there. Same thing with cheeses that are pretty dry and hard. Like if you look at a Parmesan or a aged Gouda, you don't need high intense cutting power there. So I don't know if I would say, I'd say it depends on the cheese and depends on the scenario, but like there are certain beers, like I think a brown ale, for example, that doesn't, it has like moderate carbonation, not a ton of bitterness. It's not like a super high power cutting cheese. It's not something I necessarily would match up against something where I needed a ton of cutting power, but like brown ale up against a drier, like semi-aged Gouda can be a really beautiful combination. So I don't know if that fully answers that question. It's hard to paint with a broad brush just because there's like, there's so much variation in the world of cheese. So Maria Soul asks, how would you explain the difference between cut and contrast, and how do you explain it in this particular pairing? When I think of cutting is specifically like clearing of flavor from your palate. So things that cut, the big one is carbonation. It like carbonation physically, mechanically scrubs food particles off of your palate. Um, Acidity and bitterness and astringency, and to a lesser extent alcohol, can also do similar things where they're going to help remove or kind of wipe away flavors. When I think about contrast, it's more of a balancing act between two things, and in a lot of cases it's between two tastes. So I think of like saltiness and bitterness are contrasting tastes that tend to balance one another out. If you have a very salty dish and a very bitter beer, you put those together, the salt in the dish is usually going to soften the bitterness in the beer. The bitterness in the beer is going to usually tame or diminish the perception of salt in the food. So when I think about contrasting it, it's oftentimes they're kind of coming together and diminishing one another. Sweetness and bitterness is another pretty common one. Like when people talk about Randy Mosher's classic double IPA and cheesecake, or sorry, carrot cake pairing, it's that sweetness of the carrot cake and the bitterness of the beer kind of contrasting with one another to soften one another. So in the context of this pairing, I look at the carbonation and bitterness helping to cut through sort of the fatty mouth coating elements of the cheese. I look at the bitterness of the beer contrasting with the salt of the cheese, where the bitterness and salt kind of soften one another. Max asked a question about how you handle it when the creme and the paste are basically the flavors closer to the rind and the flavors in the interior are different from one another. For example, if you had a smoked cheese where the smoke is most intense closest to the edge, which is what we had on the last master exam. It's tough in that case to pick something that's going to work well across the board, potentially, especially depending upon how different they are from one another. In that particular pairing, which was, I believe, Rogue's Smoky Blue, it was basically like working with two different cheeses. It was very difficult to find something that worked, like that really fine-tuned the pairing between the two of them. However, I would say that still a lot of the structural elements should be relatively similar between the two, because you should have similar kind of like tastes and fat components. It's not always going to be the case because especially with some cheeses, like the way they ripen, they'll ripen from the outside in, and so you'll have different textures at the exterior and the interior, which once again can add like a challenging X factor to pairing. You can go one of two routes with it. I would say you could either pick something that kind of works well with both parts. You could pick something that works exceptionally well with one of the parts and less well with the other, or you could serve it with two beers for like a fun thing to show people and say, hey, try the rind or the piece that is closer to the exterior with this beer and try the interior with this, see how they work. Oh God, Cynthia wants to know what my favorite epiphany pairing was. Oh my gosh, that's a tough question. I would almost say, I've talked about that ceviche pairing so many times. I think some of the times pairings that don't work can be bigger lessons, or like more stick with you more than pairings that do. Um, so that is one moment in particular that has always kind of stuck with me. When I think about other ones, like my favorite way to build pairings, and is to construct pairings that uh, sort of build a familiar food impression when you put them together. And this is sort of like I would say I sort of borrowed this technique from Randy. Randy talk about like putting together brown ale and camembert, and it's like liquid grilled cheese, or putting together like Hefeweizen and mozzarella, and it's like peaches and cream. One of the first ones that I can remember doing of that I really liked was doing like a pepper jack cheese with like a real pepper jack cheese where it has real peppers in it, with either like an American porter or even an imperial stout, depending upon the intensity of the cheese. And having it kind of combined to create this sort of impression of like a Mexican chocolate or chili bar, where you have like the chili and the chocolate flavors coming together. Um, that's I think an easy illustration of that concept, and is a pairing that I've always really loved. So that's one I can throw out there. Sorry, I really should have like a better go-to on that, but I don't. Let's see. Michael wants to know about the classic pairing of IPA and Malort. Why does that work so well? Man, I drank Malort and Wee Heavy last week. You know, I would say that IPA and Malort works well together because they're both bitter, and so the IPA kind of acclimates you. It helps soften the impending awfulness of the Malort. So screw you, Michael. But this one's for you. All right, folks. Thanks for joining me for this pairing session. It was a lot of fun. Y'all been great. Oh. And I hope you will join me next week for Vice Beer, which should be a lot of fun. I will see you guys then. Cheers.